Welcome to the Night Club, guys. It's your host, the Night Wrencher. I posted my first welding video up about 8 or 9 months ago, and since then I have almost 10 welding videos. Several of my videos I have this clip where I'm actually fabricating wrought iron fence, or actually it's just mild steel fence, but people tend to call it wrought iron fence. And they were asking me, how did I make the table, or where did I buy it? So today we're going to be looking at this table that I fabricated probably a year or two ago. It was during the time that I was actually welding the fence where I became more proficient in welding, and since then I've made much more videos and I've gotten a lot better at welding, and every subsequent lesson of welding always tends to get a little bit better. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. This is essentially a basic table. It's actually not that heavy. It's very light. You can, as you guys can see, I can shake it. I took everything that I had on the table off, so I have a bunch of junk on the floor just so you guys can have a clear view. Starting from the bottom, we have the legs. Everything from the top down is made out of 1x1 square tube. I believe it's 16 gauge, so it's not thick, it's not heavy. Initially I had these supports on the legs to keep everything square, but because the table is so long, this table is actually 10 feet long, I had to add supports in the middle in order to keep it from bowing down. And I noticed that after I got a couple pieces of fence welded, they had a bow in it because the length of it was not very true. It would sag a little bit, and so when I did the flip to go ahead and weld the opposite side, everything would be bowed in one direction, so you got to make sure that is pretty dead on. The general height doesn't actually matter. This particular one is actually about 41 inches to the top of the welding surface, and the whole reason I made it so high is because you want to be as close as possible. We're dealing with welding very thin metal on very thin metal. You're dealing with a lot of joints that you really want to be able to see, so the closer you have it to your face, the better you're going to be able to weld, and you're going to be able to be a little bit more intricate, a little bit more clean. If everything was a foot lower, you'd have to go down and try to work on it. It becomes uncomfortable when you're welding hundreds of times, basically a bunch of spot welds and then a bunch of beads over and over and over again. You want to keep it very comfortable. I probably would have raised it 2 inches higher. I'm about 5'11", so if I was about 5'9", 41 inches would probably be fine. If I was 5'11", probably 43 inches would be fine, and then you just keep going up and down, and that'll give you enough room for you to be able to weld, but not too high where you're actually struggling to take things on and off. Above the legs, I have what actually trues up the entire panel, and it's these little pieces right here. This is just 1x1 angle iron that I cut up in little pieces, and what I did was I actually laid one here, laid one on the opposite side, and then I grabbed a piece of 1x1 square tube and actually laid it all the way across. This is a short section, but I grabbed a 10-foot long section and I trued it up over there, and then I welded the other piece of angle iron on the back side, and then that gave me my one side. On the opposite side, I did the exact same thing, and I went from the outside edge of the 1x1 square tube, and that's what gives me the height of the wrought iron fence. So if I go ahead and take the measurement, this should be about 44 inches. You want to be as exact as you can, because if you're off by a 1/4 inch or more on either side, you could really see it. So we are 44 inches almost on the nose, and that is outside to outside. So when I was initially making this table, I designed it to weld 44-inch tall fence because that's what was already existing, and they wanted to continue that all along their property. You can determine the height of your fence to whatever you want. In fact, I actually designed this table to be expandable, so if I ever want to weld 4-foot fence, I can actually insert a piece of steel here and bring out another set of these out here, and then that'll get me to the 48 inches that I need. Once I have that all settled, I make sure I install one of these angle irons in the middle. You only need it on the outside because the slats that are going to go in it actually push out and pull in depending on how it's welded, and this thing just basically keeps it from bowing out. So I have one on either side here, and that basically just aligns the wrought iron. Once you have the 2 square tubes set up on either side and you make sure everything is nice and square and true, that's when you start setting up for the slats. So the material I use for the vertical slats is actually 5/8 square tube, and the purpose of these other pieces of angle iron right here is actually to keep the slats pretty straight. So the material that I use for the vertical slats is 5/8 square tube, and essentially what I did was I actually decided where the first one was going to go. I decided it was going to be here. I took a measurement. I made sure this thing was square to the 1-inch square tube that goes here, and then that's what sets up the very first slat. All the subsequent slats are set up at a specific distance depending on what you were going to make. And I actually use the same technique with the angle iron to keep this nice and true and square. So really, after the table's all done, you're going to be putting the two pieces of 1x1, and then you're going to cut all the slats to whatever the dimension is from the inside of the two horizontals. Then you're going to go ahead and set these inside. As long as you can get them fairly close and they all fit within the dimensions, you should be able to get something that looks a little bit like this. So this is one of the pieces that I made from a fence that I accidentally made too big, and as you guys can see, everything is welded all the way across, and it fits right here on the slats. And if I go ahead and take this one off, you're going to be able to tell that this thing lines up right here, so you guys can see this thing. So if I set this up right here, you guys are going to have a general idea of how this thing is supposed to work. So I went ahead and lined this up so the slats line up with the angle iron that I set up here, and then I have the 1x1 square tube, and this lines up right there, and then this 1x1 square tube lines up over here. This is just a section of a piece that I accidentally made too big, so it's not going to fit exactly here, but you guys get the general idea of what it's supposed to be. When you're welding it, what I tend to do is I go ahead and I tack all the way around, and then I start at the bottom and I weld up and over, up and over, up and over. So from my point of view, you'd be welding right here. You'd be pulling the welder up this way and then swinging it across, and once you get to this corner, you let it dip right here. So when you flip it, you go ahead and take this and you flip it upside down. You can actually go through and weld it the exact same way, but in the opposite direction. So you're going to start at the bottom, bring it up, bring it across, and bring it down, and that'll get your weld all the way around the slats onto the 1x1 square tube. The spacing for the slats actually depends on what you're trying to build. As far as I know, the maximum size for the hole has to be 4 inches, and that's to prevent children from getting their head stuck in between the slats and causing all kinds of issues, maybe falling out through here. If their head can fit, probably their shoulders can fit. So you want to make sure that this thing is smaller than 4 inches. The easiest way to set them up is to actually lay the 1x1 square tubes all the way across. Then you're going to go ahead and cut the slats for all of it, all the ones you're going to do. Then you're going to go ahead and mark your 1x1 to exactly the spot the slats have to be, and you use the pieces of angle iron to actually act as a spacer to keep this elevated. If you just lay this to the same dimension as this, you're going to have the slats welded even to this, and actually you're supposed to have some sort of space, but really what you want to do is you want to keep the slats centered onto the 1x1 square tube. So in that case, you're going to use the pieces of angle iron. I believe the angle iron that I use is 1/8 inch thick, so that brings everything up about 1/8 of an inch, plus the sheet metal that I used, and the band that I used to elevate all these little spacers is about 1/16 of an inch thick, so everything gets raised up about 3/16, and that'll get it centered onto the 1x1 square tube. After you get all the slats set up with the angle iron, you're going to go ahead and tack all the slats onto the 1x1 square tube. Once you have that set up, you're going to take the angle iron and push them up against the slats, because now there's resistance there, and you're going to be able to tack weld those guides onto this band that you're going to place all the way across. The reason you want to use thin gauge sheet metal is just to keep things light. The band that you want to use to hold everything together doesn't have to be too thick. It could be thin, it could be whatever. I chose this particular size because it matches up to what I need on the outside to make sure all the spacing is set up for me, and I only have to do this once. After you go ahead and tack all the angle iron, you're pretty much good to go. Typically 10-foot fence is not very common, so you probably want to do maybe 8-foot sections, 4-foot sections, 5-foot sections, or make it expandable and collapsible depending on what you actually want to do. I needed 10-foot sections because that was already existing, so that's what I made. You can buy pieces in either 10-foot sections or 24-foot sections, at least where I'm from, so I could just take 20-foot sections, cut them in half, and then I would essentially have no waste. So as long as you keep the opening small enough, you keep the spacing where it needs to be, and you make sure everything is nice and true, you guys should be able to make a ton of money building your own fences at home without having a boss. Work for yourself, do your own thing, and all it takes is a little flux core welder and a little bit of time and effort. So that's all for today. I'll see you guys all in the next one. Night Wrencher out.